Hello everyone, today we talk about the Imperial-Papal relations during the early reign of Frederick II. I made a video about the latter part, and mostly actually the build-up of Frederick's concept of imperial majesty, and the video is titled exactly like that, if I'm not wrong. This is both imperial and papal history in a sense. It exemplifies the ambiguity that existed since Frederick's Sicilian crowning in 1198, that was basically the Hohenstaufen's recognition of that political territorial dimension, while, as you know, in Germany things were going in a different way with Otto of Brunswick, that was elected by the same Pope against the promise, through the promise that Germany and Sicily would have not been reunited. Instead, Otto, as you know, the first thing he does as he comes to Italy is, of course, trying to unite it together with, say, as the Holy Roman Empire, the wall, with Sicily, which is a topic, by the way, that I discussed in a series of other videos years ago regarding the Haute-Ville-Hohenstaufen Union, which is sort of fascinating because, as you know, Sicily did not belong to the Holy Roman Empire, would never do, right? It was technically a papal fief because I realize we haven't made so much Siculo-Norman, but not even Norman history the way it deserves on this channel. I hope that the cycle has kept this back to at some point explode and talking more about the Normans, talking more about the Kingdom of Sicily, etc. But, of course, the Hohenstaufen, by becoming kings of Sicily, had tried, at least ideologically, to frame this realm within still a broader imperial dominion, for simple fact that, in fact, this was not, let's say, the empire is not a kingdom, right? It actually rules over a kingdom, and technically has to rule not just on the entire Western Christendom in this case, but on the entire world. And you know that guys like Henry VI went pretty close, actually, to, he died while he was preparing a crusade, but something that would have been the actual conquest of Constantinople a few years before the Venetians and the French did, in fact, in 1204, which happens, in fact, under Frederick. And we will see how there the Byzantine card, in a way, was played exactly because the Byzantine Empire, at least in its greater might, had been wiped out. The Haute-Ville and Frederick's mother, Constance, as long as she was alive, not long, unfortunately, Frederick was orphaned from a quite tender age, had instead been quite, vigorous about the fact, of course, that it was her kingdom as the heiress of the Haute-Ville dynasty. And so even though her own ideology was conflicting with the one of her husband, the two never really, say, fought over it. It was just a matter of defining this internationally, the papacy, also with the Siculo-Norman barons that took a war like to curb for Henry to actually rule on the land. And as you know, Frederick's minority was really a bit of a mess, both for Sicily, Germany, etc. I also made a video about the rise of Otto of Brunswick, mostly his contention with Philip of Swabia, that was Frederick I's son, and essentially the second in line after the death of Henry, and the other brother, that were three, and so Frederick's uncle, right? And you know how turbulent Germany starts being exactly from that moment onwards. All right, that's a turning point in German history. Just recently talked about princely Germany, so you know what I'm talking about. But if you want to dig a bit into the roots, as well as in the Battle of Bouvines, this sort of total game changer for Western and world history. Of course, you have plenty of videos you can draw from, but it's important here to stress what properly the papacy as well. So in Frederick in the future, in say the role of the empire and of this crown, so it could not be eliminated, could not be cancelled. That was not the papal prerogative, but that they could be, controlled by the same pope. That at this point, and I made multiple videos about Innocent III, as you know, had reached its historical peak. Right at this point, basically almost all Western Christian kingdoms are papal fiefs, right? And this is not actually an easy time for the papacy either, but it's a moment of enormous triumphs, and the idea of rising as an adoptive son after the death of his parents, in fact, the same and future Holy Roman Emperor, at least someone that was eventually, with the demise of Otto of Brunswick, that, as you've seen, backfired and was eventually, and died after his major defeat at Bouvines. So as a great defeated on the international scene in the first place, meant for him to be de facto the same thing. As we will see now, Frederick would actually not unite under himself the crowns of Germany and Sicily, etc., because that's what he had promised the papacy, but of course those who would get the crowns were his sons. So it's as if it had been the same thing. And naturally the papacy had to cope with that, because the papal states were defining in these years their temporal prerogatives within, in fact, the Patrimonium Patri, and as such, there was a pincer movement from the Hohenstaufen if they had cumulated all the crowns that in here are Italy, Germany, Sicily, Bohemia, Burgundy, Jerusalem as well, because of Frederick's accomplishment in the Holy Land, and more, that really brings, of course, to, as you know, extreme violence, right? And not just military, but an ideological one, right? The propaganda, the anti-imperial and anti-papal propaganda reach at this point in history, and especially under Frederick II's natural son Manfred of Sicily, about which I made a video, the peak properly of sophistication and of effectiveness, to a degree that, of course, say as a collateral damage, like people today read the stuff and think that it's actual history, but they don't understand it. Of course, they're being outsmarted by far, and it doesn't take really much, by the incredibly intelligent and sophisticated medieval propaganda that must be read in that sense as a political instrument. As of course, if you don't, you're just falling prey of that 800 years later. And I made a video about that, but we'll come back on it. So the narrative here is also important because, generally speaking, we at least it's a frequent narrative that I encountered also in my studies, etc. You have the idea that during Frederick's minority, the Pope had gotten everything under control. I mean, regarding the Hohenstaufen, right? Aside from Otto IV, there already arises some suspicion because, they were evidently playing to separate theaters. That's what the actual point was. The Pope knew that, also from a dynastic point of view, especially after the Brunswick's demise, that, of course, the Hohenstaufen had their way open to the succession to all these various realms. And so after Frederick's Sicilian crowning, that was the first one he got, papal consent, and because of, especially of his mother's good offices and etc., was fundamentally a failure, right? You can't actually say that the papacy got the empire right in this fashion, nor they could have done it in practice, because it was out of the reach of the same emperor. So you can imagine better the papacy that did not really have divisions on their own, say, could really control this directly. But as we've seen, also the spiritual power there was everything. Here, the papacy, in fact, had survived. It was consolidating as a power in his own regard. Exactly at this point, without anything but essentially a spiritual force. Of course, yes, they were rich, very rich in many ways, but again, the way they had become so, it's because they had won that a recognition of spiritual leadership from the very beginning, let's say, of their temporal power, which began quite early in time in antiquity itself. If you're interested, there is a Papal States playlist that I update every once in a while. But we still have to make a good video explaining how exactly the Patrimonium Sancti Petri was built step by step territorially. There is something in the video about medieval Lazio, there is also about some other late medieval stuff about the papacy, but the crucial moment, in fact, is the High Middle Ages, and that's a chapter that we haven't touched yet, but we will, hopefully. So, as you know where the papacy was coming from, I recently made some videos about, for example, the mendicant orders. Basically, the papacy had transformed itself into a monarchy, after having emerged victorious at the beginning of the 12th century with the Concordat of Worms, against, in fact, the same emperors regarding the investitures of the investiture controversy, the right to control, in fact, episcopal elections, right, and conferring the actual pastoral and ring to them, and in which areas, right? And at that point, it had literally no state proper, right? They had really won this through their spiritual capacity, but it had been quite clear, in fact, since the Gregorian reforms in the second half of the 11th century, and also the first half of the 12th. I mean, there is all a build-up that continues also at this point. Innocent III definitely reinforced that line. Had literally dictated, famously enough, in 1075, the theory of the papal plenitude of power, which basically and literally stated that whatever the Pope said, the Emperor had to obey accordingly, right? That's how far they had ideologically, also with a certain coherence, frankly, had immediately laid their basis as in that way. Like this, we don't have time to go that far, and why it had happened at the time. I have also in here a Gregorian reforms playlist that is quite hefty. It can help if you've never gotten into it. But again, this monarchy had been recognized. At the end of the day, it had been recognized by the same empire, because the two had really never disconfessed each other as institutions. I mean, those who held office surely did. Everybody was Satan, basically, according to each other, at least when they fought. In fact, Frederick II and his opponents, papal opponents, would go along the same line. And really, Europe was divided in two regarding this, because of all the possible reasons. But of course, there had always been an ambiguity regarding what really pertained practically to the papacy in terms of direct control, and what to the empire. Like the theory of two powers, the two universal powers, had never again been disconfessed. Nobody could imagine at this point a world without emperor, without pope. This Western Christendom had remained granitically coherent throughout all its history, and at least until the Reformation, but still until Napoleon, we have actually the Holy Roman Empire, and in practice, this was literally who did control this land and how, right? And as we just recall, the papacy did not really have much of a territorial power beyond certain areas of central and northern Italy, and in this way, even though theoretically the church entirely was ruled by the Pope in all its extent, the decentralization mechanism had brought, of course, some bishops to side with the emperor at times, etc. The popes had kept pushing their own plenitude of power, adducing, by the way, different proofs. One of the most famous one was debunked actually by actual papal honesty by the same pontiffs, humanists in the 15th century, was the so-called donation of Constantine, that however did have some the documents that the one was based on was a forgery. It was not even papal technically, but I will talk about this on another occasion. In any case, of course, and we've seen it, we will keep seeing it often in other videos. Of course, the church had been delegated by the empire from a very early age, and in fact the same Constantinian times, with the actual handling, the actual administration of many aspects of Christendom. It was actually very useful. The church had really been working hard for providing welfare to have, in that sense, also sources of wealth and control, because the church could not, say, maintain it by itself materially. It had to get this from somewhere. But of course, the church never dies. Also, this was one of the major points, that the papal states, everything that belonged to St. Peter technically did not belong to this world. So the emperors could not claim, for example, the rule over those goods. And this was really normal, because churches all across Christendom were endowed with immunities and prerogatives, and you couldn't quite enter there. And this had fundamentally consolidated, even, say, beyond and before the papal monarchy, the Gregorian reforms. And this was the great problem in many ways of medieval Europe. There wasn't truly an absolute state, right? And the church, in any case, had been helping consolidating the public authority that did exist, even as the church itself, that was in fact starting itself to be a sort of a monarchy, as we've seen. There had been all the Carolingian parentheses, with privileges donated, in fact, by the Frankish emperors that were attested at this point under, for example, Innocent III, in a historical, right, philological way. They were studied, preserved, and brought up as saying, look what actually Charlemagne told that we could have, which was also very ambiguous in itself. Initially, when the popes had asked for the Franks to invade Italy, and to get them rid of the Lombards, they had literally claimed that everything belonging to the Roman Metropolitic See, from the Adige River in northern Italy to literally the Strait of Messina, belonged to the papacy. It's a sort of super state, papal dominion, right? And believe me, I literally cannot digress on that specific topic, because you do find something in the Carolingian history playlist, but we haven't even began to explain technically what this got down to and what are the actual documents, what is also, unfortunately, what we largely do not know. But the problem, again, of being incapable of controlling the entire system. This was the problem of the empire. I guess it could expand, it could be recognized, whatever, but direct rule is a very different thing. Here we have the same German emperors that from Frederick II began to alienate, as we've seen, even public royal rights in the same Germany. You can imagine, of course, how complicated this had been. Look at the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, all the problems of the same Hohenstaufen among the other emperors to control Italy, and practically failing, never achieving that full control, and actually, getting exhausted in the process, right? Which is part of the reason why Frederick had ended up in Sicily. After the defeat of Legnano, his grandfather, the Hohenstaufen lost at some point on the international scene an enormous amount of power, but they were feudally, dynastically lucky and capable in having the Sicilian marriage with the Hauteville, and they had sort of come back prepotently on the scene with this hell of a kingdom that the Normans had contributed, making it really one of actually the single most politically institutionally advanced, as we've seen also in the videos about the Kingdom of Sicily, the juridical tradition, let's say, and that was also implemented further by Frederick II, as you know, and that, in fact, the sovereign preferred to rule from, right? Not from Germany, not from Italy, but from his beloved, the capital was Palermo, but the guy, as you know, is called Poor Apulia, because Apulia was apparently his favorite place in Sicily. His favorite place in Germany was Alsace. He said that. They said once, it's our, beloved, most favorite German lands. Frederick, today we will not digress on his character. I made so many videos about him, but even about that we haven't even begun. Is an incredibly complex figure, right? The way, the face, the mask he uses when he deals with the Germans or the Italians, or it's always different. It always changes. It's all sort of thought coldly, practically, ruthlessly. By the way, this was a hell of a ruler, really, and one of the greatest, surely in European history. The Stupor Mundi is not really a random or inappropriate definition. But the papacy at this point was equally powerful, equally effective. Their canonic legal collection and production at this point were consolidated, integrated with the decretals, including the famous Venerabilum, one by Innocent III of 1202, together with, by the way, other practical statements that were extracted both from Otto IV and Frederick II in the form of oaths, right? What we were saying before. Otto, I will crown you emperor. Do you promise me that you will not unite in your person the crowns of Germany and the one of Sicily? Yes, I will do it. And then, of course, he comes to Italy and tries to do the very opposite of that. In the sense, Frederick was much subtler, even though I think it was pretty clear, telling the truth. And that's yet another proof that, of course, you could be against the great imperial houses as a German prince, but every time you became emperor yourself, of course, you would pursue the same exact identical Mediterranean policy, because it was this, even if you were in this case a northerner, a Saxon, that, as you know, 19th century German nationalistic historiography said, no, those were the true Germans that were going towards the east and the north, the Baltic, whatever. No, the Swabians were corrupted because they wanted to be like the Romans in the Mediterranean. Well, Otto of Brunswick is the best example of the complete opposite of this reality. And of course, you do not know better than him what it means to rule a 13th century Holy Roman Empire. And these oaths extracted by the papacy from these rulers were naturally intended to guarantee the parity, at least, of the Roman see with the empire. It was even a clever and modest request. Because, of course, the theory of the two powers was one of integration, of mutual support, of course, for the goodness of Christianity. But aside from the theory, the ideology, and what one wishes for, of course, the problem of the German and Sicilian crowns union remained, right? What basically the papacy dealt with in the following years was ensuring the separation of these two crowns, which from the demise of Otto IV was all about this quite remarkable individual, Frederick, that had truly been grown in his youth in this awareness that, the Pope is your adoptive father, and you have their many people say things like, Frederick was unprejudiced, he was a man of science, so he was an atheist. Absolutely false, right? Frederick was a rigidly pious Christian that, of course, did his share of sin, but does not tell anything about what he actually believed. If anything, it shows the degree by which he wanted to achieve his imperial Catholic traditional destiny, and how this was seen, in fact, from a mix of all these various countries, sort of cultural backgrounds, attitudes towards the Imperium, and so on. Right? Frederick II was, in fact, very unprejudiced himself. At the end of the day, he adventurously took advantage of his election in 1211. This is before Bouvines, so when Otto is still around, and he traveled, also with significant risk, as you understand, to Germany to seize the throne in 1212. That wouldn't bring things much to an effect before, again, Bouvines, a couple of years later. But the guy was already a father. His infant son, Henry, that would become King of Germany, and actually betraying his father later, and painfully enough. You know, the curse of the Hohenstaufen, how Henry died, by the way. The son was left behind as King of Sicily to ensure the male line. The mother was Constance of Aragon, that in that way acted also as a Sicilian regent. Then we have the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, very important event after Bouvines, that basically killed off every claim of Otto IV to the empire forever, right? So this had to happen because, again, Otto had basically broken all the oaths, had just revealed his true colors, had not received enough support in Germany, had been defeated even abroad, so it was over. Frederick II had been sponsored by France, obviously not, opened at that point negotiations with Innocent III about his own Holy Roman Imperial coronation. So Innocent insisted, yet again, obviously, on the separation of the crowns. However, when Innocent himself died, Frederick II summoned his son, Henry, to Germany and had him elected, and not just German king, but also Roman one, right? So this would place him as Henry VII, by the way, as King of Germany, on the throne in 1220, and so as a would-be emperor in case of his father's demise. All right. Then things again went wrong, but this happened for other reasons. Basically, the guy was crowded by the local German princes to rise against his father, and God knows what he had in his mind. In any case, his story is pretty tragic. Frederick had to come to Germany. The son was imprisoned, and he died while he was being transported from a castle to another in Calabria. Apparently in suicide, and given that the body has been recently analyzed, it seems that he was suffering of leprosy, and so likely the guy took his own life, having fallen from literally the top, like King of the Romans, to now a prisoner that could have not been rehabilitated, and plus cursed by God with leprosy. So that was perhaps an extreme act of, destiny determination. It was the major problem, at this point in history, regarding the extreme attempt of literally becoming the Sol Invictus, the sacred god of the Imperial Catholic tradition. That by this time, even, in the early Middle Ages, the same pagans still had accepted the notion, if anything, that fate, you couldn't fight against fate, right? If you read the Norse sagas, etc., there is a glimpse here and there. In Beowulf, for example, there is a beautiful passage that says every once in a while maybe you can sort of escape your own fate, but it wasn't believed to be possible after Augustus, basically, to if not as a Roman emperor proper, to actually repristinate the golden era and the Golden Age, and Frederick II was, as the peak of medieval universalism, arguably the last one, after which the empire collapsed, and you can argue modernity opened its gates, and so this was in the mindset of a 12th or a 13th century German emperor, like the idea: can I win? Can I rise at the same height of God? Right? It was the point. The references to the Sol Invictus for the last time are present in Frederick II's documents. This is historically very, very punching, right? And that's also why the Hohenstaufen saga is as beautiful, as dramatic, just like in tragic in the best Germanic epos tradition, right? These guys, as high you rise, as low you fall, in the worst way, and it's sort of terrifying. But the sense that this had to do even with the possibility of one individual really to elevate himself to the same level of God, in many ways, was something that the papacy obviously was admonishing from, because technically that's what the imperial Catholic tradition wants. And aside from even the Christian approach to, first, like, it takes a lot if you really want to be Christ yourself, and that's also slightly arrogant of yours. Still, technically, a ruler of this world can reach, like, the medium, can bring the world back to that pristine status, especially if you are a Roman emperor. But equally, right, you have to fight against evil, and so the temptation. That's why so many people thought that Frederick was Satan himself, right? There are all the Joachimite prophecies, and many people actually believe that, because they believe that, of course, Satan has, according to the scriptures, to come to rule on earth at some point, and then after that, of course, Christ will arrive and will crush him. And here you can just imagine in the Swabian background the storming of the Asgard, the twilight of the gods, and so on, echoing in this powerfully violent, knightly, chivalric mentality that was still fresh in many ways, and that from this moment onwards will start just its decline. It started a very long one still until the 20th century, as a matter of fact, but in some parts of Europe, but in that irremediably and prophetically bitter evidence that we all know of. One interesting aspect of Frederick's settlement is that both him and his son now bore both the Sicilian and German crowns. Right. This was the Hohenstaufen historically had sort of arranged things in similar ways, preparing their heirs to the throne, and this mechanism, of course, aroused the suspicion of Pope Honorius III, who held, of course, Peter's throne between 1216 and 1227. However, Frederick II claimed that his son's German election was not of his making, but a spontaneous decision by the German princes, without whom really you couldn't become a German ruler. And that part of this consensus around Henry's German crowning stemmed from the fact that the same German princes wanted Frederick to return to Sicily and to commit himself for the crusade that the Pope had been, insistently asking for. So Honorius III at this point did not have, any valid motive to refuse an arrangement for Frederick's crowning, which in fact occurred on his way south from Germany in St. Peter's by the Pope's hands in November 1220. Now, little note historically, Frederick's imperial crowning would be the last until Henry VII, Holy Roman Emperor, not his son, but Henry VII of Luxembourg in the early 14th century. So almost 1 century later, something like 91 years, because of the Mediterranean followed to the Swabians' extinction and so on. Now, constitutionally, there was no, let's say, nothing wrong really that Frederick was doing, right? He had collected his crowns personally, as it was normally, dynastically. And so the attempt, for example, to make the Sicilian kingdom a part of the Holy Roman Empire was not there, right? Consider that he fulfilled his crusading vows as he managed to get Jerusalem back in an agreement with the Muslims in 1229. That, as you know, was not, let's say, the best, especially for the papacy, as the city would come back in Muslim hands anyway, right? But it was still important operation. It also was the last hope of the monastic military orders that at this point relied on him, particularly because the national policies of their say the kings of the other rulers of Europe was trying to cash all their possessions. Look at what happened to the Templars under Philip IV in France. But in spite of this formal neutrality, there was definitely something strange about the fact that Henry VII and then eventually Conrad IV, other son of Frederick, would become in fact German king of the Romans. So his sons and heirs would have still everything of the same crowns in their hands, right? And so one could wonder, this is just a power managed by the same family. Yes, you could have these persons, in fact, as Henry's case proved tragically, like some disagreements, these crowns are objectively separated. There was no capacity, of course, to, let's say, to control everything, like to create a super state, right? But if properly the Sicily hadn't been seen now as an imperial territory or something, the basis for further integration of power could be laid, right? And so the dynastic continuity of the Hohenstaufen really worried the popes that felt the Swabian presence ever closer all around. When you look at the bull Venerabilum, you realize how papal authority was trying to, at this point, demote the status of the empire in relation to itself. This was the older, as we've seen, Dictatus Papa's ideal. This was, of course, also an attempt to, again, there was a spiritual foundation on this basis. If the church had to comfort the empire in its spiritual achievement, right? The emperors had to be guided by the church, and so the extent by which the latter could interfere in imperial affairs was, if you want, boundless, because it went beyond merely earthly domain. Doesn't matter how much the imperium was granted by the Holy Ghost, hence, by grace itself, and so Holy Ghost in that sense meaning really that you are aggrandized in a divine fashion, and that's why for the emperors it was so relevant to also act into the religious sphere. The idea was sort of turning the emperor into a sort of church official, right? The Pope said what he had to do, and the guy would enact it, The Bull Venerabilum thus was holding this traditional view of the emperor as an advocate and defender of the apostolic see, right? We have seen in Germany how much ecclesiastical advocacy there was from laymen, except in this case, yes, you could. That was happening because, as you know, the church technically could not administrate higher justice, could not comminate, for example, the death penalty, etc. And so they were the ones who had to shed blood in this fallen world. But of course, that applied to, say, mostly as a guarantee of a recognition of the church's immunities, right? What about dominating the world? It was another story, but it was also a very concrete story, the one of the Papal States territorially on Earth, seeing themselves surrounded by the Emperor's power. So this could not really end well. Really, there was not really a solution in practice. You couldn't quite Solomonically separate these two spheres because it's a metaphysical task that, exactly because the world is fallen, the two powers cannot quite achieve, because at the end of the day, those who are in the imperial but also papal office are just fallen themselves, and so it was just in practice a confirmation of this weakness and wickedness, right, from both sides. If a more compact action would not occur, and these two powers would turn to fighting against one another, as it did. Pope Innocent III was a firm proponent of the Roman Curia's right to rule within the Papal States in central Italy and beyond. Also, Pope Honorius III was particularly aware of this direction, given that he had been Papal Chamberlain since 1188 and was, in a sense, very close to Innocent III's policy. That, again, was ever more universal in nature. So this papal policy could not simply be eliminated, right? They were right in their own regard, at least in the way that particular temporal power had affirmed itself, how the emperors had in part acquiesced and or accepted this, aside from the conflicts, the attrition on the limits of this, and so on. This was something that the papacy was building from centuries at point even of vacancy of the imperial throne. So it was impossible, in this sense, to simply, especially at this point in history, to simply give up to the war back. All right. So Innocent III, in particular, is the guy that is historiographically credited for placing the Papal States in this stronger, governmental, coercive terms. Right? We've seen it, especially in the video about medieval Lazio. It was all a great negotiation with the various communities, the role of Rome, the other latial towns, and with an increase in papal control, so in more faraway communities. Frederick II, even though he was naturally much more powerful in a territorial sense, still was aware of the fact that these papal prerogatives could be a threat for the imperial ones, right? Again, the Papal States were not territorially as large and powerful as the imperial ones, of course, but the papal spiritual power could simply, again, turn the world against the empire, and Frederick could simply not ignore that, because any say, centralization policy that he would have enacted in his own territories would have met with the interference, the sort of influence, when not properly the opposition of the papacy. So the choice that Frederick makes is quite brutal, if you want. This is proving, of course, this was a sort of wall against wall attitude. Otherwise, war would have not broken out in the first place. And this is something he did, especially in Italy, with the Pope, but also with the Lombards. That is to take on his grandfather's mask, right? The one of an inflexible, energetic, also militaristic ruler, right? That in this circumstance would assume the papal possessions beyond Latium that was considered as, say, the original patrimony of St. Peter, based upon the Byzantine Duchy of Rome, even though it's not technically what that was. Like, patrimony of St. Peter is one thing, the Byzantine Duchy of Rome was just another lay district that the Byzantines controlled for a while, that, yes, was taken over by essentially I made a video about this, about the Militia Romanorum for Rome, but also the same dynamic for Ravenna. And so it has technically not to do with what Frederick was envisaging here, but it was a way of saying, okay, I will give you that. At least Lazio historically is the Roman region, and I will leave it to you. I will not interfere with that for now. But everything that goes beyond this, that is the Exarchate of Ravenna, the Pentapolis, and the Mark of Ancona on the Adriatic Sea, across the Apennines, as much as the Duchy of Spoleto that I made a video on, and that was basically a Ghibelline enclave to some extent. It had been the whole Roman Empire, and just this thorn in the side, because it was very, for the popes, because it was very similar, very close to Rome, right? And we've seen this also recently in other videos about the Italic kingdom during the 10th century. Some dukes of Spoleto had been elected emperors because of the proximity to the election, to the urbs. So the idea is that all these territories outside of Lazio basically were to be administered by imperial officials. That's a very interesting historicistic attitude from Frederick, because consider this, that he literally declared here that there was some sort of coherence, not just with Constantine's donation, etc., but properly with the idea that they had a Byzantine Duchy of Rome, and so that the papacy technically was leaving off the legacy of this entity. That would have sort of pleased the Byzantines if this had not been obliterated just in those years. Yes, of course, there were the Palaiologoi, etc., but let's say Frederick now could simply make this claim on the ashes of the by now lost, right, Byzantine influence on Italy, that up to actually the first half of the 12th century had been quite consistent. The papacy had sort of flirted with both empires. It was technically the same one, but at least, held by different people, living in different places. And this also, however, was a radical stand, because the papacy had objectively developed their own papal states across the Apennines by now. Their power was de facto at this point limited, yes, to Latium, but in terms of direct control, and not even entirely, right, because we're talking Middle Ages here, and so things are complex, and that's why I made a video about medieval Lazio explaining exactly whose power was, because there were some lay barons, say, of Rome siding with Frederick in a way, for example. But it's also true that the papacy had extended its influence and control. It had sort of been recognized as the ruler of other lands, that especially the ones in the Romagnol area, right, Ravenna, that had also been an historical rival of Rome as an archdiocese, would be battle over, in fact, between the papacy and the empire had already been a matter of contention with Otto of Brunswick. It wouldn't be until Rudolf of Habsburg that, in order to get his Roman crown, would in fact give the Romagnol area, and also the ones, in fact, here, the Pentapolis, etc., across the Adriatic, to the Pope, right? I made recently also a video about medieval Ascoli, excuse me. I made a video about the Duchy of Spoleto, but also about the commune of Ascoli was within it, and we've seen how gradually these lands passed from sort of imperial representatives that, yes, had some control on these territories at this point, and to the papacy later on, right? So there was a, historical, let's say, promise of a, in the creation of a sort of central Italian state of some sort. The papal states, plural, are called like this because objectively they always remained pretty massive from an institutional point of view. They were incredible patchwork of different fiefs and communes, etc., and they never sort of statalized, a bit like the more orderly Milan or whatever. But they were also, in fact, difficult to control, but yet very strategic, because the Apennine passes there were crucial for the passage of imperial armies, etc. So it's always about that as well, especially when you have an emperor that rules from Sicily, right? And has to rule technically also in Italy and in Germany, and so has to go back and forth very often, like Frederick. So these problems arose. It was contained ambiguously already as a matter in the famous Constitutio Romana of 824 by the Emperor Lothar I, which had historically placed papal property under at least imperial supervision. These were the times in which the Carolingian rulers had some actual military grasp on Rome and on the papal election as well. But they had not gone, and it was really a patronizing and sort of even controlling basis that, in fact, Frederick was very interested in, and that he would use against the papal narrative, historiography, and documents, if you want, with disastrous consequences, again, because they were irreconcilable visions of the universal powers. And as you know, Urban was kind of nice with Frederick, but with Gregory IX and Innocent IV, his successors, there was literal war. I mean, the papacy invaded the Kingdom of Sicily during, by the way, when Frederick was away, and it was a severe blow right to the reconcilability of the whole system, and it would turn out actually to be a mess. Hence all the wars between the two, the point of non-return, really, and the real revelation of what these rulers really wanted, all for themselves. I'm not aware of any other, say, interpretation historiographically regarding this matter, because of course these were situations that were sort of escalating because of the will of discontents, but at the same time these were truly universal powers. That's what we forget about this, that this was not about central Italy, not even just about Germany or Italy or Sicily. This was about the whole Christendom. I mean, other kingdoms, other rulers were looking at this and saying, what about that, right? Is there still the room for the Roman Empire redivive, which Frederick would have been the greatest reincarnation? Frederick had the highest sense of Romanity that a Holy Roman Emperor really fully had in this regard. His court was the center of the world, of civilization. It was about again, what we were saying before, the possibility of man to transcend his humanity, and so his fall, his sin. There would have been a possibility, right, to really rule Europe and the Mediterranean from Palermo, but even from Rome, literally. Now, of course, Frederick's situation was more complicated by the rise of the French, that, as we've seen, had initially actually overlapped with his own fortune. But of course, it would have his father could have accomplished that in 1196 easily. Right, only 8 years later, again, the Crusaders did that. I mean, the conquest of Constantinople, and of course the reunification of the system. Later, Charles of Anjou, who killed for good the Hohenstaufen, Frederick's offspring, in a criminal way, by the way, with the beheading of a young Conrad, actually, and that's the diminutive, in fact, his age, would have done the same, would have reconquered Constantinople, when it had fallen again into the hands of the Palaiologoi, if the Sicilian Vespers, and in that sense a Ghibelline front, had not broken out from Sicily with the support of the Aragonese and of the same Byzantines again. So actually we went pretty damn close, just like with Louis IX, for example, with the conquest of Egypt, and when he died in Tunisia, like, if that had not happened, likely there was such a huge expedition, it would have taken over Egypt, it would have retaken Jerusalem. So when you look at the 13th century, you really realize how damn close they went to reachieve the unification of East and West. This is not fantasy. They were literally doing that. And Frederick was leaving, in many ways, also in his suggestions. His raison d'être, his upbringing, his legacy, his ancestry, his role, his duty, right? His religion imposed him to fight like this, and the popes too, in their role, did the same. And I would argue, as I often do when I make videos about investiture controversy in this broader conflict between the papacy and the empire, the Guelphs, the Ghibellines, etc., the West actually, in the struggle itself, obtained a civilizational boost unlike any other culture. This was already in place. Again, the investiture controversy had already happened, but the idea of having a regulated power at the end of the day, revolving around these highest ideas and also quite practical consequences, is of extreme motivational impact, right? It doesn't end. It's something that, in a way, we're still living right now, and that is the hope for, of course, obtaining a better result. When we look at this disruption of imperial-papal relation between, let's say, even before the point of no return, for example, between 1198 and 1214, you realize that he was very much driven by the legacy of his father and grandfather. There's no doubt about that. Frederick, perhaps that this is, psychologistic interpretations are feeble when talking about such great minds and doesn't make any sense, but the idea of his ancestry being challenged even in properly the imperial struggle with Otto of Brunswick in Germany during Frederick's minority is something that shakes you. Imagine that you have that hell of a legacy as a kid, as an adolescent, and having to prove yourself. Like, at that time, 16 years old, you were a full man, right? You were considered, you aged much earlier, and you were expected just to risk your life to look at, again, a Conradin, or and think about how much your legacy motivates you. That had been put in discussion, so Frederick had surely received a sort of blow from this. Frederick had also been grown in an environment that was prophesizing his divinity in some ways. He was born on December the 26th, so a year after Christ. There was a lot also in astrology that would prefigure. Astrology was, contrarily to what Christian haters think about Middle Ages, was fully accepted in the Middle Ages it was fully coherent with Christianity. The reason why, I don't know, witches were burned at the stake has nothing to do with that. Presence, right? How many, uneducated imbeciles you have met in your life that said, Christianity erased astronomy. This was the true knowledge. It's actually just we can talk about astrology at some point, because today it seems like a materialistic superstition, but technically the traditional meaning of it is slightly different. But for this reason, it was absolutely there, right? There were public offices of astrologists that were fully within the Christian. Well, of course, if the stars or some theory better based on their interpretation conflicted with the Bible, that's another story. That's where people were burned at the stake, and just not in a normal circumstances or by default or whatever. You had really to get yourself in trouble in a very stubborn way. But the sense being that this guy really was thinking. I think there's a spurious saying by Frederick II that renders, however, beautifully the idea that if that sounds something like Apuliam Deus vidisset Palestinam non legisset, which means if God had seen my own kingdom of Sicily, he would have not chosen Palestine for Christ to be born in there. And the concept was always the same, right? The idea that this was the new Phoebus, the new Apollo, the new Sol Invictus, the new God, the new man that could rise to be God and bring and save humanity and bringing it back to its divine status, to redeem their sins and to really triumph over evil. So these were the mental categories, the true beliefs that these people had, right? Which of course nobody has told you, because for you, every person wants to rule is basically just an egomaniacal bastard that you want to see taken down. Thanks for estater mental disturbances of the 19th and the 20th century, you have completely managed to ruin an entire moral and cultural and personal dimension of mankind. Well, that's the level of putrescence, in fact, in which, of course, the lesser people have made us fall in. But it's always our fault collectively anyway, so that's something that a guy like Frederick would have, of course, while dying, by the way, as yet another defeated, would have bitterly realized about this world that, yes, there is some meaning in Christianity as far as what you can get and how, and our mortal limits are, should be the measure of the greatness of God, to the point that thinking that you can reach that point, right, really requires perfection, which is hard to get, at least from quite some time now. And there are so many aspects of this all that really matter. We should talk about more. In any case, you can see that Frederican greatness all round. Think about his famous writing on falconry, his patronage of the arts, the Sicilian school of poetry. I also made a video about that, for not talking about his juridical accomplishments, his same success de facto in the crusade in 1229, aside from the fact that again the city would fall again into Ethan's hands, but there is no doubt that in his own life he was understood to be this great, and as such, depending on which side you leaned, a very positive presence or a very big threat. Again, the contemporaries were quite divided about this. Hence, that video I made on his concept of the imperial majesty that actually goes pretty closer to today's topic. There was, again, all kind of millenaristic prophecies about his life, his reign, etc. We can't quite simply digress now on them, but just know that, just try to imagine what it may mean to live in his times, and not much to be him, which is of course much more complicated, but just to start to think about history in a way that tries to take into account the moral dimension, which I haven't been seen happening really in my time, in my courses of studies, and it's something that emerges forcibly when you study history. The more you study it, right, and as long as you maintain a superficial attitude, you know it all. Like it happened like this simply because of that deterministic. It's not quite it. You must try to understand man, and as such, it's a very difficult thing, because you should know yourself at that point, and that's very difficult as well when you consider the entire challenge, especially towards the truth, the infinity, the universe, and that's exactly what these people were doing in their own regard, with their own immense ambitions, plans, but capacity as well, virtues, and it's important to understand where these powers were coming from. And I've not made yet a video that fully explains the general picture here of the papal and the imperial, say, standpoint, or how these relations had come to be. But again, the type of videos I've done so far, now I'm concluding, but just to make an example, let's search about Frederick II, how much I made. It's one of those figures you can't 8 videos. I created this playlist, I don't know when, it has only 268 views. I mean, the videos have many more views, of course, but in general, like, I realize how few there actually is in terms of interest, of knowledge, of curiosity towards these figures, in many ways, these topics. I honestly have the impression that YouTube does not like to sponsor these topics for some reason. If you look at, again, the amount of money that it pays to other topics, more, even historical ones, but still trivial. Like, of course, everybody loves the Roman Empire, and you know that, you can hardly find anyone that does more than me. But I mean, there are ways and ways of talking about the empire, and I haven't still seen one decent on this platform. And I'm not saying that I'm the one who's so cool and the others a bunch of imbeciles. I'm just saying that literally my standards that on YouTube are naturally much lowered to the average, and of course the fact this is not how I write articles, in fact, is incredibly low. And I don't get how people can waste so much of their time about things that are not challenging, are not actual history to much degree, right? And how we are popularizing the wrong type of storytelling, the wrong type of attention topics, etc. And unfortunately, this is under everybody's eyes. In any case, yeah. The orange stuff and playlist. Let's. Too few. 26 videos, 755 views, even less. It's not really heartening, is it? Well, anyway, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.